The morning sun shone brightly over London as Thomas Bailey stepped out of his hotel, map in hand and camera hanging around his neck. At 32, this was his first trip outside of America, something he'd been saving for since he started working at his father's hardware store back in Ohio. London had always called to him through movies and TV shows. The history, the accent, the royal family. All of it seemed magical from across the ocean. "You're going to love Buckingham Palace," said the hotel receptionist who had helped him plan his day. "If you get there by 11, you can catch the changing of the guard. It's quite a sight." Thomas checked his watch. It was only 8:30. Plenty of time to grab breakfast and maybe see another sight before heading to the palace. He found a small cafe on a corner street where the tables spilled out onto the sidewalk. The menu was written on a chalkboard above the counter, and Thomas ordered what the man in front of him had, something called a full English breakfast. When the plate arrived, Thomas stared at the spread of eggs, bacon, sausages, beans, mushrooms, tomatoes, and toast. It was enough food for an entire day. He snapped a quick photo to send back home before diving in. "First time in London?" asked an older gentleman at the next table, noticing Thomas's map and obvious tourist demeanor. "That obvious, huh?" Thomas laughed. "We can spot you Americans a mile away," the man said with a friendly wink. "Where are you headed today?" "Buckingham Palace to see the changing of the guard." The man nodded approvingly. "You'll want to get there early to get a good spot. Those guards, they're a serious bunch. The Queen's Guard, they're called. Most are from elite regiments with hundreds of years of history. Not just pretty uniforms, mind you. They're real soldiers." Thomas listened, fascinated. Can they talk to people? Or smile? "Absolutely not while on duty," the man explained. "Their job is to protect the royal family and the palace. They stand perfectly still for hours, no matter what happens around them. People try to make them laugh or react, but they're trained not to. It's quite impressive, really." This piqued Thomas's interest even more. After finishing his massive breakfast, he thanked the man for the information and continued his journey, stopping briefly at Trafalgar Square to see the giant lion statues and take a few photos. By 10:30, Thomas had reached the area around Buckingham Palace. The crowd was already building. Tour groups with colorful umbrellas held high, families with excited children, couples taking selfies with the palace gates in the background. He managed to secure a spot near the front of the crowd, right along the fence where the guards were positioned. The guards stood like statues, tall, straight, and completely motionless. Their red uniforms were immaculate, buttons gleaming in the sunlight, and their bearskin hats added at least a foot to their already impressive height. Thomas was immediately drawn to one guard in particular, a black man whose face showed no emotion whatsoever. Something about his absolute stillness was mesmerizing. As Thomas watched, he noticed other tourists trying to get reactions from the guards. A young woman posed for a photo while making a silly face next to one. A little boy waved his hand in front of another's eyes. None of the guards blinked or moved a muscle. "They're not allowed to move or speak," a tour guide was explaining to her group nearby. "They've been doing this since the 1600s. These soldiers are from some of the most elite regiments in the British Army." Thomas felt a tap on his shoulder and turned to find three young men about his age, clearly Americans by their baseball caps and loud voices. "Hey man, you here alone?" one of them asked. He introduced himself as Pete, and his friends as Rick and Danny. They were college buddies on a graduation trip around Europe. "Yeah, just me," Thomas replied. "First time in London." "Us too. We've been here 3 days, and man, it's been wild," Pete said, his voice slightly slurred despite the early hour. Thomas noticed they all carried paper cups that didn't seem to contain coffee. Are you guys drinking already?" Thomas asked, surprised. "It's London, baby," Danny laughed. "The pub's open early here. We're just getting warmed up for the day. Want some?" He offered Thomas a cup that smelled strongly of beer. Thomas politely declined. "I want to actually remember seeing the palace, thanks." "Suit yourself," Rick said with a shrug. "Hey, check out these guards. They're like robots or something." The three friends started discussing how funny it would be to make one of the guards crack a smile or break character. Thomas felt uncomfortable with their increasingly loud conversation but didn't want to seem unfriendly. "I heard they can't react no matter what you do," Pete said, his eyes fixed on the black guard near them. "They'll get in trouble if they move, even a little bit." "That can't be true," Thomas replied. "They must be allowed to defend themselves or respond if there's an actual problem." "Nah, man. It's like their whole thing. They have to stand there no matter what," Danny insisted. "Some guy on our hostel tour said he saw someone get right in a guard's face once, and the guard didn't even blink." As the crowd grew thicker around them, Thomas noticed the three friends getting bolder, egging each other on. They'd move slightly closer to the guard, make a comment, then back up, laughing among themselves. "I bet I could make him laugh," Pete finally said, finishing whatever was in his cup. "20 pounds says I can get a reaction." "Don't," Thomas said firmly. "The man's just doing his job." "Relax, it's all in good fun," Rick replied. "These guys expect it. It's part of the tourist experience." Thomas wasn't so sure. As more people pressed forward to get a good view for the upcoming changing of the guard ceremony, Pete managed to slip under the rope barrier that kept tourists a respectful distance away. He moved closer to the black guard, whose eyes remained fixed straight ahead, showing no acknowledgement of the boundary violation. "Hey there, big guy," Pete called out, his voice loud enough to turn heads in the crowd. "Do they make you stand out here because you look scarier than the others?" Thomas felt his stomach tighten. This was quickly crossing a line. A nearby tourist, with a British accent, muttered, "Someone needs to stop that idiot before he gets arrested." But Pete continued, emboldened by the attention and his friends' laughter. "Can you even see us under that giant furry hat? Bet they make you wear it to hide that nappy hair, right?" Several people in the crowd gasped. A mother quickly covered her child's ears and hurried away. Thomas felt a wave of shame wash over him just for standing near Pete and his friends. "That's enough," Thomas said, stepping forward. "You need to back off and show some respect." Pete glanced back at Thomas with a dismissive laugh. "What are you, his bodyguard? I'm just having some fun. These guys are paid to stand here and take it." Before Thomas could respond, a uniformed palace security officer appeared, moving swiftly through the crowd. He was middle-aged with a stern expression that suggested he'd seen this type of behavior before. "Sir, I need you to step back behind the barrier immediately," the officer said to Pete, his tone leaving no room for argument. For a moment, Pete looked like he might object, but the officer's unwavering gaze convinced him otherwise. He stumbled, back to his friends who were now trying to act as if they weren't with him. "Let's go check out the gift shop," Danny suggested, suddenly eager to be elsewhere. "Nah, I want to see the changing of the guard," Pete insisted, his words slightly slurred. "We can't leave yet." Thomas took a deep breath and decided to distance himself from the group. He moved several yards away, finding a new spot with a clearer view of the palace gates. A family with 2 young daughters stood nearby, the parents pointing out details of the palace architecture to the children. As he settled into his new position, Thomas couldn't help but glance back at the guard who had been the target of Pete's comments. The man remained perfectly still, his expression unchanged, but Thomas thought he could see something in his eyes, not anger or offense, but something deeper. Pride, perhaps. Dignity in the face of disrespect. The crowd began to stir with excitement, as music could be heard in the distance, signaling the approach of the new guards for the changing ceremony. Thomas found himself wondering about the man behind the uniform. Where was he from? What had his journey been like to become one of the elite guards protecting the royal family? How did he manage to stand so still while idiots like Pete tried to provoke him? As the ceremony began with its precise movements and traditional pageantry, Thomas felt a new appreciation for what these guards represented. It wasn't just about the fancy uniforms or the tourist attraction. These were trained soldiers upholding centuries of tradition through their discipline and professionalism. And somehow, by standing perfectly still in the face of harassment, that black guard had shown more strength and character than Pete and his friends could ever understand. The changing of the guard ceremony continued with its perfect synchronization and historic ritual. Thomas found himself caught up in the pageantry, the crisp movements and the sounds of the military band playing traditional British songs. Tourists around him held phones high above their heads, trying to capture every moment. Children sat on parents' shoulders for a better view, pointing and asking questions. But Thomas couldn't fully enjoy the spectacle. His mind kept returning to the uncomfortable scene he'd witnessed. He glanced back to where Pete and his friends had been standing, and was relieved to see they had moved further down the fence, still watching, but seemingly more subdued under the watchful eye of the security officer who had positioned himself nearby. As the ceremony progressed, Thomas noticed a young woman with a press badge hanging around her neck, taking notes on a small pad. She was dressed professionally in a light blazer despite the summer heat, her curly hair pulled back in a neat bun. Something about her focused expression and the way she observed everything with keen interest caught Thomas's attention. When the ceremony ended and the crowds began to disperse, Thomas overheard Pete's voice rising again. He turned to see that Pete and his friends had moved closer to the black guard again, emboldened perhaps by the security officer's attention being drawn elsewhere by a lost child. "Hey there, Mr. Guard," Pete called out, his voice louder than before. Several people turned to stare, some with disapproval, others with uncomfortable curiosity. "I've got a question for you. Do they make you guys practice standing still, or is it just something that comes naturally to your people?" Thomas felt his face grow hot with embarrassment and anger. The racial undertone in Pete's question was unmistakable. The guard, however, remained absolutely motionless, his eyes fixed forward as if Pete didn't exist at all. "Come on, man," Danny said, pulling at Pete's arm. "Let's go. You're going to get us kicked out of here." "No way," Pete replied, shaking off his friend's hand. "I've got 20 pounds riding on making this guy move, remember? Besides, these guards are just tourist attractions. That's why they dress them up in these silly outfits." The journalist Thomas had noticed earlier was now watching the situation unfold, her pen poised over her notepad. A few other tourists had stopped to observe the scene, some filming with their phones. Pete stepped closer to the guard, now just a few feet away from him. "What's the matter? Don't you speak English?" he taunted, his words slurring slightly. "Or are you not allowed to talk to Americans?" Thomas couldn't stand by any longer. He pushed through the small crowd that had gathered and approached Pete. "That's enough," Thomas said firmly. "You're being disrespectful, not just to him but to this whole country. Back off." Pete turned to Thomas, his face flushed from the alcohol and the heat. "Mind your own business, man. Nobody asked you to be the tourist police." "I'm making it my business," Thomas replied, standing his ground. "You're embarrassing yourself and every other American here." The security officer who had intervened earlier was now making his way back through the crowd, his face set in a grim expression. Behind him were 2 uniformed police officers, their pace unhurried but purposeful. "Looks like you've attracted some attention," Thomas said, nodding toward the approaching officers. Pete glanced over his shoulder, his bravado faltering slightly at the sight of the officers, but instead of backing down, he seemed to double down on his behavior. "One last chance to get a reaction," he said, turning back to the guard. He pulled out his phone and held it up, clearly recording now. "Say cheese, buddy." Then to Thomas's horror, Pete stepped forward and reached out toward the guard's hat, as if to knock it off. Before his hand could make contact, the guard's arm shot up with lightning speed, catching Pete's wrist in a firm grip. The movement was so quick and unexpected that several people in the crowd gasped. "Step back, sir," the guard said, his voice deep and commanding, but perfectly controlled. It was the first time anyone had heard him speak. "Touching a king's guard is an offense. I am authorized to detain anyone who attempts to interfere with my duties." The crowd fell completely silent. Pete stood frozen, his mouth open in shock, his wrist still held firmly in the guard's grip. I was just joking around," Pete stammered, suddenly sober-sounding. "I am not a joke, sir," the guard replied evenly. "I am a lieutenant in His Majesty's Armed Forces currently performing my sworn duty to protect the sovereign and this historical site. Please step back behind the barrier." He released Pete's wrist with a slight push that sent the American stumbling backward. The guard immediately resumed his position, standing straight with his weapon at his side, eyes forward as if nothing had happened. The security officer and police officers reached the scene. One officer put his hand on Pete's shoulder. "I think you've had enough sightseeing for today, sir," the officer said. "We'd like to have a word with you about appropriate behavior at royal residences." As the officers led Pete away, with Rick and Danny following anxiously behind, Thomas noticed the journalist was writing furiously in her notepad. She caught his eye and approached him. "Excuse me," she said in a British accent. "I'm Alexandra Powell from the London Chronicle. Did you know that man?" "No," Thomas replied. "I just met him today right before the ceremony. But you stood up to him," she noted. "Not many bystanders would do that. Would you mind if I asked you a few questions about what happened?" Thomas hesitated, not wanting to get more involved than he already was, but something about her earnest expression made him agree. "I'm Thomas," he said, extending his hand. "And honestly, I didn't do much. The guard handled it perfectly." "Lieutenant Anthony Wilson," Alexandra said. "He's been with the King's Guard for 8 years, one of their most respected officers." "You know him?" Thomas asked, surprised. "I did a feature on diversity in the Royal Regiments last year," she explained. "He was one of my main interviews. Brilliant soldier. Cambridge educated. Could have done anything, but he's passionate about military service and representing modern Britain." Thomas glanced back at the guard, Lieutenant Wilson, who remained perfectly still at his post despite the commotion that had just occurred. "What will happen to the American guy?" Thomas asked. "Probably just a stern talking to and maybe a small fine," Alexandra replied. "Unless he decides to make more trouble. The Royal Guards are authorized to defend themselves in their posts, but they're trained to use minimal force." As they spoke, a small crowd had gathered around them, tourists curious about what had happened. Thomas heard snippets of conversations in various languages, people explaining to each other what they'd witnessed. "Can't believe that American tried to touch the guard. Did you see how fast he moved? So they can actually respond if you try to touch them." Alexandra smiled slightly as she observed the crowd's reaction. "This will make quite a story. Royal Guard's perfect response leaves tourists stunned. What do you think?" "Sounds about right," Thomas agreed. "Though I'd add obnoxious before tourist in that headline." They both chuckled, the tension of the moment finally breaking. "Would you be willing to give me a proper statement about what you saw?" Alexandra asked. "As an American tourist who witnessed another American behaving badly, your perspective would add something valuable to the story." Thomas thought about it for a moment. He hadn't come to London looking to get involved in any kind of incident, but he felt a responsibility to set the record straight. "Sure," he finally said. "But I want to make it clear that Guy doesn't represent most of us. Some of us actually come here to learn about and respect other cultures." As Alexandra began asking him questions about what he'd witnessed, Thomas found his gaze drawn back to Lieutenant Wilson. The guard stood perfectly still once more, his face impassive, the very picture of discipline and professionalism. But Thomas thought he could detect the slightest hint of pride in the man's posture. Not pride in having put Pete in his place, but pride in having carried out his duty with dignity and restraint. In that moment, Thomas felt a strange connection to this man he'd never spoken to, a respect for someone who could face disrespect with such composure and strength of character. Little did he know that this incident was far from over, and that his involvement was just beginning. By early afternoon, Thomas found himself sitting across from Alexandra at a small cafe near St. James's Park. The outdoor table offered a perfect view of the park's famous lake where pelicans glided across the water and tourists fed the ducks despite signs asking them not to. "So you're here on your first trip to London," Alexandra said, stirring her tea. She had already jotted down Thomas's account of what happened at Buckingham Palace and was now asking more background questions. "What made you decide to visit now?" Thomas watched a double-decker red bus pass by before answering. "I've always wanted to see the history here. Back home in Ohio, our oldest buildings are maybe 200 years old. Here you have places that have stood for 1,000 years." Alexandra nodded, understanding. "And what do you think of London so far? Apart from the unfortunate incident this morning." "It's amazing," Thomas admitted. Different from what I expected, though. More modern in some ways, more ancient in others. And so many different kinds of people. That's London, Alexandra agreed. One of the most diverse cities in the world. That's partly why what happened this morning caught my attention. Lieutenant Wilson represents the changing face of traditional British institutions. As they spoke, Alexandra's phone buzzed with an incoming message. She glanced at it and her eyebrows shot up in surprise. "Well, this is interesting," she said. "My editor just sent me a link. Someone posted a video of the incident online, and it's already going viral." She turned her phone so Thomas could see the screen. The video showed the exact moment when Pete had reached for the guard's hat and Lieutenant Wilson's swift response. The clip was short, less than 30 seconds, but it had already gathered thousands of views and comments. "That was fast," Thomas said, uncomfortable seeing himself in the background of the video. "Is that going to cause problems for Lieutenant Wilson?" Alexandra shook her head. "Quite the opposite, I expect. He responded exactly as regulations permit. Minimal force, clear warning, immediate return to duty. If anything, this video shows his professionalism. The palace has had issues with tourists harassing guards for years. This might actually help highlight the problem." She scrolled through some of the comments on the video. "Finally, been waiting to see one of these guards. Put a disrespectful tourist in their place. That guard moved so fast, ninja skills. As an American, I apologize for this idiot. We're not all like this, I swear." Thomas winced at the last comment. Seems like Pete's becoming the latest ugly American poster child. "These things tend to blow over quickly," Alexandra assured him. "Next week there'll be another viral moment for everyone to focus on." Just then, Alexandra's phone rang. She checked the caller ID and excused herself to take the call, stepping a few feet away from the table. Thomas could see her expression change from curiosity to surprise as she listened to whoever was on the other end. When she returned to the table, she looked excited. "That was my editor. The palace has issued an official statement about the incident. They're not only supporting Lieutenant Wilson's actions, but using this as an opportunity to remind visitors about proper conduct around the King's Guard." "That's good news, right?" Thomas asked. "Very good news," Alexandra confirmed. "And there's more. Lieutenant Wilson has agreed to give a brief statement to select press tomorrow morning. My editor wants me to be there." She paused, studying Thomas thoughtfully. "Would you be interested in coming along? Having you there, an American tourist who stood up against the harassment, would add an interesting dimension to the story." Thomas hesitated. He had planned to visit the British Museum tomorrow. His trip to London was short and he had a carefully planned itinerary, but he couldn't deny feeling invested in what happened next with Lieutenant Wilson. "I'd like to be there," he decided, "if it helps tell the whole story." Alexandra smiled. "Excellent. The statement will be at 10 a.m. at Wellington Barracks. That's where the guards are based when they're not on duty at the palace." As they finished their drinks, Alexandra's phone buzzed again with another message. Her eyes widened as she read. "You're not going to believe this," she said. "That American, Pete, has just posted his own video online with his side of the story. He's claiming he was assaulted by the guard and is threatening to sue the palace." "What?" Thomas couldn't hide his shock. "That's ridiculous. He was trying to knock the guard's hat off. Everyone saw it." "Well, in his version, he was just reaching up to wave and the guard violently grabbed him," Alexandra read from her phone. "He's calling it an international incident and saying the guard targeted him because he's American." Thomas shook his head in disbelief. "That's not what happened at all. There were dozens of witnesses." "Including you," Alexandra pointed out, "which makes your testimony even more important now." By the time Thomas returned to his hotel that evening, the incident had become a full-blown media story. The hotel receptionist recognized him as he walked through the lobby. "You're the American from the palace today, aren't you?" she asked. "The one who stood up to that horrible man? It's all over the telly." Thomas nodded uncomfortably. "News travels fast." "My brother's in the army," she continued. "Says those royal guards are the best of the best. Takes incredible discipline to stand still for hours while tourists try to make you laugh or react." In his room, Thomas turned on the television to find a news channel discussing the incident. The viral video played, followed by commentary from a panel of experts discussing everything from tourism etiquette to race relations. "What we're seeing here," said one commentator, "is a perfect example of how people of color in uniform are often subjected to additional harassment." Lieutenant Wilson handled the situation with remarkable restraint. Another panelist nodded in agreement. "The Royal Guards represent Britain to the world." Lieutenant Wilson demonstrated exactly the kind of dignity and professionalism we want associated with our country. Thomas switched off the TV and checked his own phone. He had several messages from friends back home who had somehow already connected him to the viral video. His mother had texted, "Is that you in that video from London? Call me." He sighed and flopped back on the bed. This was not how he had imagined his London vacation would go. The next morning, Thomas met Alexandra outside Wellington Barracks. A small group of journalists had gathered, setting up cameras and checking audio equipment. The atmosphere was professional but charged with anticipation. "Thanks for coming," Alexandra greeted him. "Pete's video has gained traction overnight, especially in America. Having you here to counter his narrative is important." Before Thomas could respond, the barracks door opened and a military press officer stepped out. Behind him was Lieutenant Wilson, now dressed in a different uniform. A khaki service dress that looked more like a business suit than the bright red ceremonial uniform he'd worn on guard duty. Without the bearskin hat, Thomas could see that Lieutenant Wilson was younger than he'd expected, probably in his early 30s. He carried himself with the same precise posture he'd shown on duty, but his expression was more relaxed, though still serious. The press officer addressed the gathered journalists. "Lieutenant Anthony Wilson will make a brief statement regarding yesterday's incident at Buckingham Palace. He will not be taking questions at this time." Lieutenant Wilson stepped forward, and the cameras started rolling. He stood straight, hands clasped behind his back, and spoke in a clear, measured voice that carried natural authority. "Yesterday, while performing my duties as a member of the King's Guard at Buckingham Palace, I was required to intervene when a visitor attempted to interfere with my uniform. My response was in line with our standard procedures for such situations." He paused briefly, his gaze sweeping across the assembled press. "The King's Guard has a proud history dating back centuries. We represent not just the monarchy, but the people of the United Kingdom in all their diversity. Every day, millions of visitors from around the world come to witness our ceremonies and traditions. The vast majority show appropriate respect and consideration." Lieutenant Wilson's voice remained steady, but Thomas thought he could detect a hint of passion beneath the professional exterior. "When we put on this uniform, we uphold values of discipline, respect, and excellence. These values transcend nationality, race, or background. They are universal principles that allow us to serve with honor." He nodded once, signaling the end of his statement. "Thank you." As Lieutenant Wilson turned to go back inside, his eyes briefly met Thomas's in the crowd. There was a moment of recognition, and the guard gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Before disappearing back into the barracks, the press officer stepped forward again. "The palace will be releasing an official portrait of Lieutenant Wilson this afternoon, along with details of his distinguished service record. Thank you for your time." As the journalists began packing up their equipment, Alexandra turned to Thomas with a satisfied smile. "That," she said, "was a masterclass in dignified response." Thomas nodded, still processing the lieutenant's words. He didn't mention Pete at all, didn't talk about race or nationality, just focused on values and tradition. "Exactly," Alexandra replied. "And that's going to be the headline. Royal Guard responds with dignity after harassment, not giving Pete's claims any oxygen at all." As they walked away from the barracks, Thomas noticed people on the street looking at their phones, some pointing to the barracks and talking excitedly. "Lieutenant Wilson's statement is already going viral," Alexandra said, checking her own phone. "Even faster than yesterday's video." Thomas couldn't help but smile. Sometimes, the most powerful response to disrespect wasn't anger or retaliation, but simple dignity. After Lieutenant Wilson's press statement, Thomas and Alexandra walked through St. James's Park, discussing how quickly the story had spread. "Article goes live this evening," Alexandra said, checking her watch. "My editor's given it prime placement on the website. How long are you in London for?" I fly back to Ohio on Friday, Thomas replied. 3 more days. Well, you've certainly had a more eventful trip than most tourists, she said with a smile. What's on your agenda for the rest of today? Thomas pulled out his carefully planned itinerary from his pocket. I was supposed to visit the Tower of London this afternoon, but honestly, I'm feeling a bit overwhelmed by everything that's happened. Alexandra nodded understandingly. That's perfectly normal. Being unexpectedly thrust into the spotlight can be disorienting. They reached a park bench overlooking the lake and sat down. A light breeze rustled the leaves above them, providing welcome relief from the summer heat. I keep thinking about Lieutenant Wilson, Thomas admitted, standing there for hours, having to deal with people like Pete day after day. I can't imagine having that kind of patience and discipline. It's impressive, Alexandra agreed. But what I found most remarkable was his statement today. He could have made it about himself, about being harassed or disrespected. Instead, he elevated it to something bigger, about values and tradition. They sat talking. Alexandra's phone rang again. She answered, listening intently for a minute before her expression changed to one of surprise. You're kidding, she said into the phone. When did this happen? Yes, he's actually with me right now, and I'll ask him. She lowered the phone and turned to Thomas. That was my editor. Apparently, Pete has been trying to contact various news outlets to tell his side of the story. He's claiming he was set up, and is demanding an apology from the palace. Thomas shook his head in disbelief. He's still pushing this? After the video clearly shows what happened? There's more, Alexandra continued. He specifically mentioned you in some of his statements, claiming you were part of a setup to make American tourists look bad. What? Thomas felt a surge of anger. That's ridiculous. I'd never even met the guy before yesterday. Alexandra put her phone away. My editor wants to know if you'd be willing to go on record with a more detailed statement, specifically addressing Pete's claims. Thomas hesitated. He hadn't come to London looking for this kind of attention. He was just an ordinary guy from Ohio who happened to be in the right place at the wrong time. Or was it the wrong place at the right time? He wasn't sure anymore. I need to think about it, he finally said. This is getting more complicated than I expected. I understand, Alexandra replied. Take your time. But just so you know, Pete's been very vocal on social media. His posts are getting traction, especially back in the States. Thomas pulled out his own phone and searched for news about the incident. Sure enough, several American news websites had picked up the story, with headlines like American Tourist, Claims Assault by British Royal Guard, and International Incident at Buckingham Palace. He scrolled through one article that quoted Pete directly. I was just being friendly, trying to interact with the guard like everyone else does. Then this other American guy started causing trouble, and suddenly, I'm being grabbed and threatened. It feels like I was targeted for being American. This is unbelievable, Thomas muttered. He's completely twisting what happened. Just then, his phone buzzed with an incoming call. It was his mother. With a sigh, he answered. Mom, I'm fine, he said immediately. Yes, that was me in the video. No, I'm not in trouble. I was just standing up for what's right. I'll explain everything when I get home. After ending the call, Thomas turned to Alexandra with a determined expression. I'll do it. I'll give a statement. Pete shouldn't be allowed to spread lies about what happened. Alexandra smiled. I was hoping you'd say that. How about we head to my office now? We can record your statement and have it ready to go alongside my article this evening. An hour later, they arrived at the modern glass building that housed the London Chronicle. Alexandra led Thomas through the busy newsroom, where journalists typed furiously at computers and editors huddled around screens discussing layouts and headlines. In a small recording studio, Thomas sat in front of a camera, while Alexandra asked him questions about what he had witnessed. He described Pete's behavior, the guard's response, and how he felt compelled to intervene. As an American, I was embarrassed by how Pete was acting, Thomas explained. But I also want to make it clear that most American tourists don't behave that way. We respect other countries, their traditions, and their people. After the interview, Alexandra showed Thomas how his statement would be incorporated into her article. We're also including background on Lieutenant Wilson's military career. Did you know he served in Afghanistan and received a medal for bravery? Thomas shook his head. I had no idea. He's quite remarkable, Alexandra continued. After Cambridge, he could have pursued any career, but he chose military service. In interviews, he's talked about how important it was for him to represent modern Britain in traditional institutions. As they finished reviewing the article, Alexandra's editor approached them. He was a tall man with salt and pepper hair and reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. We've just received something interesting, the editor said. Pete's travel companions, Rick and Danny, have reached out to us. They want to distance themselves from his claims. He handed Alexandra a printout of an email. They say they were embarrassed by their friend's behavior and don't support his version of events. They've confirmed that he was intoxicated and deliberately trying to provoke the guard. Thomas felt a wave of relief. So there are witnesses backing up what really happened. Exactly, the editor nodded. This gives us a much more complete picture for the article. By evening, the London Chronicle had published Alexandra's article online with the headline, Dignity Under Fire, Royal Guard's Response Captivates the World. It included Thomas's statement, background on Lieutenant Wilson, and comments from Rick and Danny contradicting Pete's claims. The article quickly gained traction online, being shared thousands of times across various social media platforms. Other news outlets began picking up the story, now framed as an example of professionalism and restraint rather than an international incident. Thomas returned to his hotel room that night feeling both exhausted and relieved. His phone had been buzzing, constantly with messages from friends and family who had seen the article or his interview. Even his boss from the hardware store back home had texted, "You're making Ohio proud, son." As he was preparing for bed, Thomas received an unexpected email from Alexandra. The subject line read, "You might want to see this." He opened it to find a link to a social media post. Pete had gone silent online after Rick and Danny's statement became public. His last post was brief but telling. Taking time away from social media to reflect on recent events. There are two sides to every story, but sometimes you have to admit when you're wrong. Thomas couldn't help but smile. Perhaps there was hope for Pete after all. The next morning, Thomas decided to get back to his original vacation plans. He visited the Tower of London, taking in the centuries of history and listening attentively to tales of the crown jewels and famous prisoners. As he wandered through the ancient fortress, he found himself thinking about how this building had stood witness to countless human dramas over the centuries, his own recent experience just a tiny footnote in the grand scheme of things. Yet as he moved through the crowds of tourists, he noticed something strange. People were looking at him, whispering to each other and occasionally pointing in his direction. At first he thought he was imagining it, but then a young woman approached him hesitantly. "Excuse me," she said in an Australian accent. "Are you the American from the Royal Guard video? The one who stood up to that rude guy?" Thomas nodded reluctantly. "Yes, that's me. Could I take a photo with you?" she asked excitedly. "My friends back home won't believe I met you." Before Thomas could fully process what was happening, he found himself posing for a selfie with the Australian tourist. As she walked away, others approached with similar requests. Thomas had somehow become a minor celebrity in London. The good American, as one person called him. It was surreal and uncomfortable, but also strangely heartwarming. People kept thanking him for showing there are decent Americans who respect other cultures. By lunchtime, Thomas had escaped the attention by ducking into a small, out-of-the-way pub. As he sat in a quiet corner with his fish and chips, he checked his phone to find an email from an unexpected source, the British Embassy in Washington. The email was formal but warm, thanking him for his commendable conduct during an unfortunate incident at Buckingham Palace. The embassy official wrote that Thomas's actions represented the best of American values and helped strengthen the special relationship between our two nations. Thomas read the email twice, hardly believing what he was seeing. His simple act of standing up against disrespect had somehow become a minor diplomatic moment. As he pondered this strange turn of events, Thomas looked up to see a familiar face entering the pub. It was Lieutenant Wilson, now dressed in civilian clothes, a simple button-down shirt and jeans. Their eyes met across the room, and after a moment of surprise, the lieutenant gave a small nod of recognition. Thomas froze, unsure of what to do. Lieutenant Wilson stood just inside the pub entrance, scanning the room. When their eyes met again, Thomas hesitantly raised his hand in greeting. After a brief pause, Lieutenant Wilson made his way through the crowded tables toward him. "Mr. Bailey?" the lieutenant said, extending his hand. "Quite a coincidence finding you here." Thomas stood to shake his hand, noticing the firm grip. "Lieutenant Wilson, please call me Thomas." "Anthony," the lieutenant replied with a small smile. "I'm off duty now." There was an awkward moment of silence before Thomas gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Would you like to join me?" Anthony nodded and sat down. "I hope I'm not interrupting your lunch." "Not at all," Thomas said, pushing his half-eaten fish and chips aside. "This is unexpected." A server approached and Anthony ordered a cup of tea. When she left, he turned back to Thomas with a thoughtful expression. "I wanted to thank you," he said simply, "for speaking up that day, and for setting the record straight afterward." Thomas shook his head. "I didn't do much. Anyone would have done the same." "That's not true," Anthony replied. "Most people stay silent when they witness something uncomfortable. They look away or pretend not to notice. You chose to step forward." The server returned, with Anthony's tea, and he thanked her politely before continuing. "I've been doing ceremonial guard duty for 5 years now," he said, stirring his tea. "The number of times I've been harassed or mocked, well, let's just say it's not uncommon." Thomas frowned. "I'm sorry to hear that." Anthony shrugged. "Most of it is harmless, people trying to make me laugh or blink. I can handle that, it's part of the job. But sometimes, like with your countryman the other day, it crosses a line." "He doesn't represent most Americans," Thomas said quickly. "I know that," Anthony replied with a reassuring nod. "Just as I don't represent all British people or all black men. We're individuals first." Thomas relaxed slightly, grateful for Anthony's understanding. "Your statement yesterday was remarkable, so dignified and measured." "Years of practice," Anthony said with a hint of a smile. "In my position, you learn quickly that responding with anger only escalates situations. Dignity is always the better path." "It certainly made an impression," Thomas admitted. "The video of your statement has gone more viral than the original incident." Anthony chuckled softly. "My mother called this morning to tell me I'm trending on social media. She found it quite amusing. Said she finally has something to brag about at her book club." The image of this distinguished soldier's mother proudly showing off viral videos to her friends made Thomas smile. It was a reminder that behind the uniform and the ceremony was a real person with a family and a life beyond Buckingham Palace. "How long have you been in the military?" Thomas asked. 12 years now," Anthony replied. "Joined right after university. My father served for 30 years before me." "A family tradition?" "In a way. Though when my father joined in the 1980s, there weren't many people who looked like him in the elite regiments. He faced challenges." Thomas nodded, understanding the unspoken meaning. "And now you're one of the most visible soldiers in Britain standing guard at the palace. Ironic, isn't it?" Anthony said. "My father couldn't believe it when I was selected for the King's Guard. He came to my first changing of the guard ceremony, stood in the crowd and took about 100 photos, even though I was standing completely still." Thomas laughed at the image. "Parents are the same everywhere." As they continued talking, Thomas learned more about Anthony's life beyond the ceremonial uniform. He lived in a small flat in East London with his girlfriend, a pediatric nurse. He played rugby on weekends and was studying for a master's degree in international relations. His dream was to eventually work in diplomacy, representing Britain abroad. "What about you?" Anthony asked. "What's life like in Ohio?" Thomas told him about the hardware store he helped manage, his weekend hiking trips in the nearby state parks, and his plans to start taking night classes in business administration. This trip to London was my first time leaving the United States, Thomas admitted. I've been saving for years. And now you've become part of a minor international incident, Anthony said with amusement. Not the typical tourist experience. Definitely not what I expected when I was planning my itinerary, Thomas agreed with a laugh. Their conversation flowed easily, two men from different worlds finding unexpected common ground. As they talked, Thomas noticed a few people in the pub glancing their way, clearly recognizing them from the news coverage. I think we're being watched, Thomas said quietly. Anthony nodded without turning around. I noticed. Fame is fleeting, though. By next week, there will be a new viral story capturing everyone's attention. I hope so, Thomas said. I'm not cut out for celebrity status. Me neither, Anthony agreed. Though my commanding officer was quite pleased with all the positive press for the regiment. Said applications to join are up 30% since the video went viral. Before Thomas could respond, the pub door opened and 3 people walked in. Thomas recognized them immediately. Pete, Rick, and Danny. His stomach tightened with apprehension. Pete scanned the room much as Anthony had done earlier. When his eyes landed on Thomas and Anthony sitting together, he froze, his face draining of color. Rick and Danny noticed a moment later, looking equally uncomfortable. Should we leave? Thomas asked quietly. Anthony shook his head slightly. Let's see what happens. After a brief conversation among themselves, Pete surprisingly began walking toward their table, followed reluctantly by his friends. Thomas tensed, preparing for another confrontation, but Anthony remained perfectly calm, watching their approach with the same steady gaze he maintained on guard duty. Pete stopped a respectful distance from their table. He looked different from the loud, obnoxious tourist of 2 days ago, subdued, even nervous. Excuse me, he said, his voice lacking its previous swagger. I wanted to apologize. To both of you. Thomas exchanged a surprised glance with Anthony, who gave a small nod, encouraging Pete to continue. What I did was stupid and disrespectful, Pete continued, looking at the floor rather than meeting their eyes. I've been drinking too much on this trip and I acted like a complete idiot. There's no excuse for it. He finally looked up, first at Anthony, then at Thomas. The things I said, they were offensive and wrong. I'm truly sorry. The pub had grown quieter, with nearby patrons listening intently to this unexpected scene. Anthony studied Pete for a long moment before speaking. Apology accepted. Pete looked surprised at the simple response. Just like that? Just like that, Anthony confirmed. Everyone makes mistakes. What matters is how we learn from them. Pete turned to Thomas. And I'm sorry for dragging you into this, trying to blame you in those interviews. That was cowardly. Thomas nodded, still processing this unexpected turn of events. Thank you for saying that. Rick stepped forward. We've been talking to Pete about his behavior, about how he needs to think about the impact of his words and actions. It took seeing myself in those videos to realize how awful I looked, Pete admitted. My mom called me yesterday, crying after seeing the news. Said she didn't raise me to act like that. Danny added, We're flying back to Boston tomorrow. Pete's agreed to talk to someone about his drinking when we get home. Thomas felt a wave of empathy for Pete. Behind the brash exterior was someone struggling with his own issues, someone capable of recognizing his mistakes and trying to make amends. Would you like to join us? Anthony asked, gesturing to the empty chairs at their table. I was just about to order lunch. The unexpected invitation surprised everyone, including Thomas. Pete hesitated, clearly not having anticipated this response. Are you sure? He asked uncertainly. I'm sure, Anthony replied. We all have something to learn from each other, I think. As Pete, Rick, and Danny pulled up chairs, Thomas marveled at Anthony's capacity for forgiveness. There was no lingering anger or resentment, just a genuine openness to moving forward. The server returned, surprised to find their table had grown from 2 to 5. As they ordered food and drinks, the initial awkwardness began to fade. The conversation was tentative at first, but gradually became more natural. Pete asked thoughtful questions about Anthony's military service and life in Britain. In turn, Anthony inquired about their lives back in America. Thomas watched this unlikely exchange with amazement, thinking about how a moment of conflict had transformed into an opportunity for understanding. At one point, a young boy approached their table, looking at Anthony with wide eyes. "Are you the guard from the video?" he asked shyly. Anthony smiled warmly. "I am." "My dad says you showed how to be brave without being mean," the boy said. "I want to be like that when I grow up." As the boy returned to his parents, Thomas noticed Pete watching the interaction with a thoughtful expression. "That's quite a legacy," Thomas commented to Anthony. "We never know who's watching or learning from our example," Anthony replied. "That's why every interaction matters." By the time they finished their meal, something remarkable had happened. 5 strangers from different backgrounds and countries had found common ground. Addresses and phone numbers were exchanged, promises made to stay in touch. When they finally parted ways outside the pub, Pete's handshake with Anthony lasted a moment longer than necessary. "Thank you," Pete said quietly. "Not just for accepting my apology, but for showing me a better way to be." Anthony nodded. "Safe travels home." As Pete, Rick, and Danny walked away, Thomas turned to Anthony. "That was unexpected." "Life usually is," Anthony replied with a smile. "That's what makes it interesting." Thomas had to agree. His carefully planned London vacation had taken an extraordinary detour, leading to this moment of connection that crossed boundaries of nationality, race, and experience. "I fly home tomorrow," Thomas said, "but I'd like to keep in touch if that's okay." "I'd like that," Anthony replied, shaking Thomas's hand firmly. "And next time you're in London, the first round is on me." As they went their separate ways, Thomas thought about how a moment of conflict had led to unexpected friendship. He had come to London seeking history and culture, but was leaving with something much more valuable, a reminder of our shared humanity and the power of treating each other with dignity and respect.